Hello, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the British Society of Soil Science webinar. I'm Jack Hannam, and I'm the current president of the British Society of Soil Science, and this is our 9th webinar of the year. Before I welcome our panelists, I'd just like to introduce BSQ, the British Society of Soil Sciences, as host of today's webinar. We're an established international membership organisation and charity committed to the study of soil in its widest aspects. So we bring together our membership, those working in academia, but we also have a growing number of people working in industry and business putting soils into practice. And we also welcome anybody, in fact, who has a keen interest in soils to become a member of the Society as well. I think we're hosting around about 10 webinars in 2024. Keep an eye on our website. I think we've got one more this year. You can also catch them up with ones that we've done already on YouTube channel as well. And just before we begin, a little bit of housekeeping. So there's lots of you on the call today. We are keeping your microphones muted. And we're running this session as a kind of panel session today. So we're not having presentations from our two guests. So we'll be posing a few questions, and this is more of a kind of panel discussion around the subject of the webinar. But if you have any questions, please pop them in the chat in the questions box, and we'll try and pick those up as we go along if they come in through various points, but there will be time at the end and I'll try and cover most of those. So do try and submit them by 2:50 and we'll come around to those at the end of the session. Also, we have CPD points for the seminar. So if you are registered with BASIS or NROSO, please do use the email on the screen there to contact the office afterwards to claim your CPD points for those two organisations. And as you're probably aware, we're recording this session. And as I said, if you'd like to watch back any of this, it will be available on the BSQ YouTube channel after the event. Okay, so I'm really excited to welcome our two esteemed panelists today. And we have Christine Howes, and she's currently Director of Howes Associates, and this is a practice specialising in mineral waste and planning and landscape restoration. Prior to this, she was a director at Wardell Armstrong for a period of over 21 years. So she's got enormous amount of experience in restoration and remediating contaminated land, together with the reinstatement of mineral and former waste disposal sites. And our second speaker is Claire Dickinson. And she has, again, a huge wealth of experience, so over 30 years experience in the land development sector. And she's a specialist in contaminated land. And has a background in geotechnical engineering. It's particularly specialised in ground risk management advice. And she's juggling running her own consultancy, which is Geo-Environmental Matters Ltd, with also part-time lecturing at the University of Portsmouth as well. And I won't read out, but she has this whole number of accolades there, but she's been involved in lots of committees, particularly Syria as well, so that in terms of their steering groups, particularly around the contaminated land programme, and including an update of the environmental good practice guide that has been developed by Syria as well. So I'm really excited to have both of these panelists with an enormous amount of expertise on the session today. So the session is focused around soils in a kind of urban context, specifically thinking about soils in brownfield sites. And to kind of guide some of the discussion, what we wanted to do was pose a few questions first to kind of set the scene for the panelists. So I'll be sort of inviting some answers and opinions from both Chris and Claire. So I guess, the first question we want to ask really is then, the sort of what question. So lots of people work with soils in lots of different kind of environments and sectors, but what does good soil function look like in an urban context? I wondered who wants to kind of take that first question. Maybe Chris?
Yeah, I'll start with that. I mean, it's an interesting one because, soils in a rural context is quite easy because often they're managed for agriculture, so they're positively managed. Whereas in an urban context, once they are in situ, that generally tends to be it. So I
Hmm.
think there are a number of challenges there that, if we don't think about drainage and compaction, then soil as a resource can be seriously challenged in an urban context. So, and I think it's often overlooked once it's placed, and there's a landscape scheme in place. It's actually what consideration is given to soils, and top dressing, mulching, that sort of thing should be critical. It should happen, but how often
It's
does it
kind of
happen?
forgotten about a little bit.
Yeah,
Yeah. Not caring for them as much as we might do maybe in a sort of system where
yes,
we're growing
yeah,
food or something like that. Yeah.
definitely,
Claire,
yeah.
do you want to come in?
Yes, I think that we're going to, we're perhaps beginning to see this story change, and I'm very much hope that will be the case because we want our soils in an urban context to um, not be contributing to the flooding problem. One of the big issues, of course, with the urban landscape is we seal the soils in, which prevent them
Mm,
functioning. There's a disconnection in terms of how they perform quite often. So I think one of the big things that we are seeing shifting is that sustainable and urban drainage is becoming very much mainstream, and we have a real opportunity to bring soils into that sort of solution. And we can begin to think about how that might work, both in terms of sort of the public realm and urban treescapes, which again, they're going to help with mitigate some of the climate change issues such as the urban heat island effect that happens in
mm,
these sort of urban environments. Trees are very good at dealing with that sort of thing. We could start looking at perhaps bringing soils in other places like green and brown roofs. So, I like to think that the context of urban soils, as we have seen, is not what we perhaps will be looking forward to in the near future.
yeah, it's interesting to think of it's sourced in a completely different way. It's an interesting comment that you made about thinking about those sorts of soil substrates on roofs, actually, so those sorts of things don't exist in our kind of rural landscapes, but we still have to manage those soil substrates, for them to provide that kind of infiltration function, I guess. So there's a lot around any other sort of functions that are really important that we want soils to, I guess, do in urban systems. So we
So
talked
I
a little bit about,
think
yeah, around the flooding.
one of the other issues is how do we measure the metrics of what a good healthy soil in the urban environment looks
We
like? And I
could
think
spend
that's one of
a seminar doing, yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Uh, and I know that's something that DEFRA are really trying to grapple with at the moment because a lot of the works that have been done on soils, as you've spoken about, are in that agricultural land space. But
Mm.
what would a healthy soil look like, and what functions do we want out of it? And of course, one of the issues, and we're talking about brownfields here, not all brownfield sites are contaminated, but a lot of
No.
brownfield land is contaminated. And obviously, we don't want to be allowing that contamination to be spreading and interacting with the environment. And when we start thinking about the function of soils, so what we've just mentioned, they help with prevention of flooding. Once you start allowing percolation of water down and through the soils, potentially you're mobilizing contamination. So, you need to begin to think about what that might look like. Another real challenge for these brownfield sites, I mean, brownfield first is really being talked about at the moment. The new government have put even more great emphasis on that,
Yes.
but actually they can have some really important habitats. So we have the BNG aspect of it, which, you know, they have sometimes really quite unique habitats because they've been left to their own devices. And how do we manage BNG in that context? I don't know whether Christine, you've got anything to add there from, obviously a landscaping and planting
Yeah,
context.
I
Mm.
mean, if they're left long enough, you're right, Claire, and they're unique enough. I know of some that have become triple SIs. So in which case you're
Amazing.
not going to develop them at all, and they throw up some interesting challenges. Local example to where I live is lime beds in Cheshire.
Hmm.
They've got a unique flora and
Yeah.
wind blown flora, and totally unique to anything else within the local context. So yes, and I think some of our brownfield land that hasn't been touched because it's very expensive to do so in perversely has then acquired a unique habitat environment. So yes, not all brownfield lands are developable. Certainly, we've got to look at it in that context as well. So interesting.
Yeah, it's really interesting thinking about this sort of emerging concept around novel ecosystems. So things that have been created by which are kind of man-made
Yeah.
systems,
Yes.
exactly
Yeah.
like you described,
Yeah.
but they actually become, really kind of rare habitats and ecosystems in their own right.
I
We
mean,
kind of
one of
think,
the one of the interesting things, Jack, is I think it's for education in the urban context as well. This is where our major conurbations are,
yeah,
and it's educating our kids basically what is soil, what is in soil. It would be interesting to see some systematic research done, in different urban soils to see how healthy they are in
yeah,
comparison to rural soils. It could throw up some interesting results. With everybody saying that rural soils are being degraded or don't have the insect and worm life in them. It could be from an
maybe we're
educational point
bucking
of
the
view.
trend. We don't know. There is a real gap, I think, a real data knowledge
Yeah,
gap there.
yeah,
Absolutely. Yeah, you're right.
yeah.
And I think I don't know if you want to add anything more. I think that's a really, really nice scene setting actually, for thinking about soils in that sort of context. But I think I might move on to the next question, which is more about the sort of so we've got thought about the what, but the sort of how question. So there's some quite sort of complex policy and regulation and legislation around urban systems and planning. So it'd be really nice to kind of get your ideas around, how soils are currently kind of recognised or categorised in sort of brownfield sites and the urban area more widely. And then to think about sort of, the context of the national planning policy framework. So, how are soils sort of appearing in that, and what needs to kind of change to really try to protect soils in that sort of planning process. So I put both questions up because they kind of intertwine, so feel free to sort of pick up on either of those. I don't know
I
who wants to go
think,
first. Claire,
yeah,
Chris, go ahead if
yeah.
you're
I just want to by putting my planning hat on,
hat on.
So
Yeah.
I think soils for a long time, particularly in the EIA process, I've been the poor relation.
Mm,
All sections in EIAs tend to deal with agricultural land classification and their value in terms of agriculture, whereas I think they should be actually treated much more as a resource. So how much soil have you got on site? What type of soil it is? And how are you going to deal with it through the planning process? Does your site have enough capacity to hold it correctly? Can it be stored
yeah.
correctly in accordance with guidance? And if it can't, what are the alternatives? Because sometimes it would be better for a good quality soil to leave site if it can't be treated correctly, and then, look at bringing in soils later in the process. None of that currently exists at the moment, and soil, just tends to get disregarded and sold off. And
Mm,
and then when you come to the end of the development process, there's not enough of it, or again, it's treated in a poor context. So I think we need to give it a lot more respect than we currently do. I think through the soil assessments in EIAs, that could go some way towards it. I mean, we quite have rigorous standards for noise, air quality, all the other areas and specialisms, but we don't quite have that with soils.
so how are they I don't know if the audience will be familiar with the environmental impact assessment, but how are soils considered at the moment, or aren't they at all?
Well, they are,
um
normally you're dealing with them, but it's actually, looking at their ALC classification
okay,
and,
it's just a productivity
yeah,
function then. Yeah.
yes,
Mm,
largely, yeah,
yeah.
largely.
That's what we see very much, Jack, on the guidance currently on the Gov.uk website. But some of the audience may well be aware that IEMA did produce in 2022 a sort of new approach to looking at EIA in soils, and that is beginning to look much more at soil function. And
Yeah.
I'm personally, I think that's that's what we need to be looking at, is what are our soils doing for us in a particular location. Because they do many things and they mean many things to many people. And we're here today at BS Cubed, and you've got a lovely picture here of somebody with a spade and just looking at the topsoil. But I mean, if you're talking about it in a brownfield redevelopment context, then there are many different parties that will be dealing with soil, and they will have a very different idea. As a geotechnical engineer, I'm not interested in any of that. That's something I've got to get through to find
It's
something to
getting in the way.
pound on.
Yeah.
Yes, it's in the way. And I mean, why do we think that in mineral excavations they call it overburden? Again, they're just not interested, are they? And yet,
Yeah,
it
yeah,
is a resource. And I think when you look at what I mean, back in 2015 was the International Year of Soils, and they very much drew on the soil function aspect, which covers all these things, whether it be your food and fibre production, how it interacts with our environment, because it is part of the regulation, isn't it, of our water and air environment. It's supporting of different habitats, which we talked about. It's also a value in terms of our cultural heritage. So one of the things that
yeah.
we've got geoarchaeology, the former landscapes, and the other part is providing a construction for platforms. We need to understand what our soils can do for us. And that really needs to be at the planning stage, because we want the right development or not development in the right
Mm,
location, don't we? So, I mean, we don't want to be taking a ancient forest that has had its topsoil developed over hundreds of years, which is very unique ecosystem. We don't want to be developing that if we can possibly avoid it. So it's really, for me, it's at that planning process. Let's make sure we've got the right development happening in the right place. And to do that, as Christine says, you've got to understand what you've got. And that's a real
yeah,
problem at the moment. And if we come back to the National Planning Policy Framework, as you look at soils, it says that within the development plan, it should highlight, that's the each local authority's development plan, where there are
yeah.
soils that need protecting. But I think unless it has a designation like SSSI, that is not necessarily being accommodated. And even in the more recent consultation that came out, there was one single question that mentioned soil. It was question
Oh, wow.
74, and it was
Right down at the
obviously
end of the list. Yeah.
and
Yeah.
it was all it was beginning to say, should we think about peat soils, so again, quite narrow
Mm.
in what it's looking at, like.
Exactly, and I
So
think this is it. There's sort of, their particular focus on those easy things to label, like you say, either peat or a designated site or something, but actually looking at the sort of holistic function of those soils is not considered at all at the moment. It's it's tricky, I guess, like, how to kind of like integrate that. But I think, like you say, exactly right at the beginning, then is actually broadening that piece in the planning policy to actually start to look at all of those different types of functions and what is potentially going to be lost then to development if that happens. So not
it,
just in terms of like the habitat that soil is supporting, but the soil itself.
in some ways they've sort of tried to do that, because they say they want sustainable development. And what the National Planning Policy Framework goes on to say is that is to protect, enhance our natural built and historic environments. This sounds good. They then go
Yeah.
on and say this includes making effective use of land, improving biodiversity, using natural resources prudently, minimizing waste and pollution, and mitigating and adapting to climate change while moving to a low carbon economy. Now, all of those things, soil is part of the
Mm,
story. So
yeah,
why are we not
absolutely.
dealing with it? It seems quite bizarre, doesn't it, when when you look at what government says they're trying to achieve, and yet we still don't have soil specific legislation. It's still soil is the Cinderella environmental issue.
Yeah, because it's a thread through all of those things that you just listed, absolutely. But in its own right, there is no specific protection. Yeah.
Yeah, I think we really need to have a soil trading system that needs, I mean, the problem with soil is it's big and it's bulky, so it's
Mm,
costly to move. So if you move it off site, then you've got to move it back. There's a sort of cost implication with that. But, I think we've got to really, I mean, soil is absolutely vital. It is not and should not be classified as waste in any shape or form. That does not help, and it doesn't help
yeah.
the whole process of really treating it with with the respect it needs, because as we've touched on habitat already, and biodiversity, and in some cases you don't, if that's what you want to do on site, you probably don't need a topsoil. You need a subsoil to create a sort of environment that's a low fertility. But we shouldn't be wasting the good quality
Stuff.
soil. It
Yeah.
should be going
Yeah.
to a home where it's doing a good job, and I just don't think we've
Yeah.
tackled those issues. Haven't tackled them at all.
Yeah. Yeah. There is a big gap.
Currently, our
Mm,
a regulatory system, it makes it easier for us to dispose of soil than it does to
yeah,
maintain and keep it on site or move it to another site. And that is obviously something that really is against everything we're trying to achieve in terms of
Yeah.
sustainability, circular economy, and
Yeah.
I think
mitigating and adapting to climate change.
yeah. And certainly, I know we touched on this before, soils on site, new residential estate. People aren't given a choice. They're given a choice at everything in their home. What type of kitchen, what type of this and that, but nobody's given a choice that actually I would like a back garden that has good soil in it so I can cultivate fruit and vegetables. Usually what goes in rear gardens is rubbish. It's badly drained, and then it's very expensive to bring material in afterwards. Perhaps we ought to be giving choice to people that we do want the option of a decent soil in our garden.
Yeah. That's good. I think we can go on to the next slide actually, because we're kind of answering some of those questions. But yeah, going down that, so
Yeah,
we're talking about policy and legislation, so the sort of wider aspects, but actually on, when you're on site. So,
yeah,
now is like the who
yes,
question,
oh,
like,
we
well,
answered that one.
yeah, it's fine. It's fine. It's a fluid dialogue we're having. It's fine. But so who is actually then doing those kind of initial, resource plans in designing those sort of developments and projects on brownfield and greenfield sites? And your question, Christine, we can expand on that a little bit about
Yeah,
how do we then sort of manage that on site, and can you choose your own soil? I want to have, I want to grow veg in my back garden, not try and grow it in some kind of rubble that's been left behind in the development process.
yeah, yeah.
Um, so yeah, I mean, who's kind of responsible, I guess, for those sort of initial resource plans and
Oh, there's the $1 million question, isn't there? Because
yeah.
at the moment, there's no requirement to,
Yeah,
unless you're probably in an EIA situation. But for smaller sites that perhaps don't have an EIA, there is a requirement to provide a report up front, a study minimum to look at the risk of contaminated soils being present. But looking at the general soil quality that may or may not be present, I don't think that is being routinely done. And it needs a person that has the right skill set to do that, because a geotechnical engineer isn't going to look at it. A contaminated land specialist isn't going to be looking at that, the sort of texture and functions of that top layer that we're certainly, I think more of your audience probably are interested in. Um,
So does it like fall through the cracks then, because it's kind of no one's responsible, or no one is responsible for looking at it in that way.
Particularly if
It's a bit
it's
of a
not that prime agricultural land that Christine was
mm,
talking about, I think it
mm,
probably does fall through. I mean, I think if you're looking at a greenfield site, then yes, that is, best value agricultural land or whatever, it will be taken on board. But I think, the consideration of what you've got soil wise when you start on on a site that isn't in the green agricultural environment is probably something that doesn't happen routinely.
Yeah.
And it's having the right people to do that, and that is something that needs to be looked at, and something we can pick up on a bit later is about that whole skills gap piece. So
Yeah,
it would be
exactly.
good
Yeah,
to see that required, wouldn't it? To see people understand what they've got in the beginning, and then the way that you've got
yeah,
BNG. If you're trying to bring biodiversity in, surely you should look at what your soil is, because for it to be effective and efficient, you want to work with the soils you've got, and that's something that Natural England have really made the point on. That we should work with what we've got, not trying to, make something different in an area where the soil can't actually support that different habitat.
yeah. I think that's very true, Claire. Because really, from a sustainability point, you should ideally keep it on site.
Yeah.
Keep your soils on site and use them appropriately. It would be wrong on a big site to lose soils where, you're looking at your landscape plans for the site, sports pitches, the types of thing that need to grow, good quality turf, etc. They probably need the better soils. I've always found that trees grow, this is a bit contrary to some advice, but I always they grow much better on good soil than poor soil. Whereas if you want wildflower meadow, then you do want something that is very nutrient poor, So I think it's actually looking at what you've got and making sure that, wherever possible, those are handled properly. Again,
Mm.
one of the things with major developments where you might have several thousand houses on a site that's going to be developed over a long period of time is how long those soils are in storage.
Yeah.
It might be, yes, or they are 2 meters high and they're over there, and then they tend to be forgotten about. And what is actually happening to those soils? Again, I don't think there's an awful lot of research that says, what's the value of the soil after a year, after 2 years, after 5 years, after 10 years? What does it look like then? It might be, in theory, it's topsoil, but it might not be looking too good 10 years on. So, again, I
I
think
don't
we
think
lack.
so. Yeah, especially in
Yeah.
some of these big stockpiles and things. I think,
Mm,
there's been some research. I mean, looking at, the whole kind of microbiome is changing. There's no oxygen right in this, if you
mm,
imagine, right in the center of a heap, so you're
yeah,
completely changing all of those processes. And then, yeah, you know, take the soil from the stockpile and expect it to suddenly, flourish and function as
mm,
as you would want it to. And similarly, I guess it's a really important point that you say, where you're thinking about different types of uses or habitats. So, is matching the sorts of soils for that. So, you can't just bring in a whole load of topsoil and spread it everywhere and expect it to deliver on a sports turf and a habitat and a play park and
yeah,
everything else. It's working with that heterogeneity in the urban systems is really important as well.
yeah.
So yeah.
And it's
I mean,
thinking
certainly,
about,
yeah. Sorry, Claire.
I was going to go on to say that it's about not just, bringing that in, Jack, as you say, and spreading it around, but what you're spreading it on, because if they've over
Yeah.
compacted it, or degraded it in other ways, then it's still not going to function properly, is it? Because you're still going to get poor drainage and poor root penetration, etc. So you've got to look at those soils holistically. But this issue of degradation during development, I think, is a real issue. It's not just about the stockpile, but I mean, what happens when people start on a construction site? They get all excited, they come in, don't they strip all the
Yeah.
topsoil off, um, and hoard the site. And if it's a large site, they're probably not going to be working in all areas of that site at one time. Do they actually need to be stripping all the topsoil in one go? Because once you've
Mm,
stripped it, it's then at risk of erosion. If we're getting eroding soil, not only are we losing that, but then we get the situations where we're getting silt-laden runoff that's then getting into our watercourses as well. So, we've got to start thinking more holistically about what we're doing. It's not business as usual. We need to be changing what we're doing if we're going to protect and manage our soils better.
yeah. No, that's a really important point about thinking about, again, it is sort of that sort of heterogeneity in all sorts of dimensions. So in sort of two dimensions from one place to another with depth. Exactly, and then over time as well. So yeah, it was really interesting thinking about they like to make a big impression, don't they? First of all, it's like, right, we've stripped the site. This is, we've made the boundary. I
We're
could use
ready.
other words there, but I hadn't really sort of considered that before about this kind of incremental like development. You don't have to do all of that at once and show off that you're doing it and your big placards up with your new shiny pictures of houses on. This is what it's going to look like, and actually, do that sort of piecemeal be much nicer and be easier then to manage the soils. And again, that whole process of, well, what do we do with all this stuff that we've taken off? Yeah,
So just
that's really
something to think about. And the trouble is that,
interesting.
if we destroy the soils that we're trying to manage, they then become waste. We've then got to get rid
Yeah,
of them. So we've lost so much value then, because we've lost the value of what they were in the first place. We then have all the carbon associated with transporting them off-site somewhere else, and all the carbon bringing something else on, and all the cost that's associated with that. So not looking after our soils is actually costing
yeah,
the construction industry money.
yeah. Agree. Great, thanks. So we touched on this before, but if we go on to the next slide, thinking about with this again, it's the sort of who question. Perhaps we can expand on this a bit in terms of the what the sector looks like. So is it sort of future fit? What gaps are there currently in the sector for for skills and education and data and things like that as well? So we touched a little bit on the skills thing. So I don't know if you want to sort of pick up on that point first, about what's missing or what needs development, and who those people are.
I'm just wondering whether we turn the question on you, Jack, as
As an
as
education
Cranford University.
provider.
Yes.
Yes. What are you doing
Yes, that's
about
it.
this? Yeah. Well, I think it's probably the same answer everywhere, is that, because soils cuts across all of those different things. So we kind of, appears in agriculture, it appears in a little bit in the sort of, engineering and the planning sector and these sorts of things. But is there enough of it that is relevant to those different sectors? I think probably there is definitely a gap here, in the planning side of things, actually, for this understanding. So going back to like who's doing these resource plans and things like this, are there are various people then that require some additional kind of upskilling. So is that the ecologists? Is that the people on site? And certainly, we've seen soils, there's a big focus in agriculture. There always has been, in terms of, if you like, sort of university led courses, not so much in the kind of construction and the planning sector. So I think there is still a gap there, certainly, for that. We have to do a quick plug now, but there is a new soil science apprenticeship that is starting, which hopefully goes some way at looking at soils in these different sectors. It's not just in rural systems, but looking at soils in urban environments as well. So that's a different mechanism of delivery as well, through the apprenticeship level. So it's then people who are working who are able then to access education. So there's a whole host of different ways, I guess, we can look at how to fill the gaps.
And I think what you've said previously is that, when we talked about getting the public more aware, because actually, we've seen what's happened when the public has got up and shouted about sewage in our rivers and seas and whatever. There is actually some action happening. Might be slow, but we can see that there's a bit of action happening there. How do we get that message about what soils do for us? Because I think one of the problems is, and this is something Defra was talking to us about, is this understanding of the role that soils plays in, for example, like climate mitigation and adaptation, how important they are. How are we getting this message across? How do we get people interested in wanting to come in and choose a course in soils? Because if you don't know about it, how do you know that you want to do it? How do you know that it's going to be interesting, fulfilling, and help us all, make the world a better place to live in? And I think you've said previously that actually in primary schools it's quite well
Yeah.
dealt with. But once you move beyond primary school, I think you've said that's where it all begins to fall apart, really.
Yeah, there's barely anything really, and if you look across, we did a bit of curriculum mapping in BS Cubed where soils was being taught, and of course it's different in the devolved nations as well. But apart from Scotland did quite well actually, but actually when you start to look at the GCSE syllabus for things like geography, biology, that tends to be where soil is sitting. And then also at A levels, it really does diminish, and there are only a couple of um, specific exam boards where soils is part of that particular curriculum. So again, you have this sort of complexity. So until there is some momentum to sort of change the content of the curriculums, which as we know is quite tricky to do, so there will be curriculum, periodic curriculum reviews. It's quite difficult then to pivot that. There are some new proposals for new GCSEs in. There's one for natural history. I've kind of lost track of where we are with that, but there's an obvious home for kind of soils in that, so ecology, geology, geomorphology, and soils. But I think it's a real shame actually, because it's going back to that beginning point we made about it appears in all of these different sectors and these different disciplines. Actually, it's a real connector, but we don't really talk about it
Join
at
the
schools.
dots.
That join the dots up in schools, yeah.
We
And
don't
also,
join the dots.
that, and having, I guess, is working also with teachers as well about having confidence to teach soils again. So if they haven't taught it because it hasn't been part of the curriculum, so you have this sort of unfortunate negative cycle, then they could potentially embed it perhaps in some of the work that they're doing, but if they haven't been teaching it for a long time, or if it's completely new content, so there's then opportunity for, I guess, organizations like BS Cube to we're creating kind of resources for teachers to kind of use that make it that, and engaging and interesting, exactly like you say, Claire, in terms of, well, what is actually soil doing. It's really important for X, Y, and Z, to raise it, the profile actually with the sort of younger generation. We need to kind of campaign, don't we? So it's where the
We
problem
need
is
a
with campaigns,
Brian
it's always very
Cox of
negative.
soil, don't we?
We need something that has a positive message rather than all the soil is degraded, but actually look at all these things it does for us. Into this sort of,
Yeah, maybe soil is life, isn't it? With no
yeah,
soil, we have no life, do we really? Because it's the food we eat, and it performs so many functions, and carbon capture and everything. I think as you say, it tends to be scattered across so many disciplines, but maybe geography. I mean, that's where I first encountered it from an educational point of view, is through geography, O level in my day, and A level.
yeah.
And so it was very well entrenched, but I don't know what they're like these days. But that's where it ought to be. It ought to be strong in those areas. Yeah.
We've got questions. Sorry, I'm trying to keep an eye on the questions as well,
Yeah.
but I will pick up on some at the end. But there is one actually that is relevant here around sort of whether, universities or other kind of educational institutes can add modules on the use of soils in landscaping and construction. So I'm not as familiar, obviously, with that, rather than kind of agriculture and geography. So I don't know whether you have an idea of how whether soils are kind of taught in those sectors, in sort of um, landscape architecture or in construction specifically, or whether that
Well, certainly in landscape, I don't think it's strong enough. I mean, in my landscape degree, obviously it's touched on, but I feel very strongly as a landscape architect as well that soils and aspect are absolutely crucial to any landscape scheme. The two
mm,
together are so important, to realise what you're trying to achieve. So I think there could potentially be more, more emphasis on that in universities. But the problem is, as landscape courses are somewhat in decline as well, which is it's a vicious circle, isn't it, of making sure that we've got it embedded in where it needs to be. And obviously in landscape architecture it needs to be, yeah,
yeah.
because otherwise you will not succeed if you don't understand what you're working with.
No, exactly, exactly. And I think this is again, a problem with this siloed thing, isn't it? That it sits in a particular discipline. So you sort of you look at it through that lens,
Yeah,
very
yeah.
specifically in like engineering or something. So you're really, looking at the geotechnical properties of the soils, but not thinking about it in a more sort of holistic way. So is it gonna, is it
Mhm.
gonna hold up the house or the bridge or whatever? But actually, what else is it potentially doing? Um,
Mm.
so there's some quite interesting, I think, yeah, work needed within. I mean, I don't, in some way, soils is part of lots of different things. So I don't have a problem with it appearing in lots of different places. But I think then perhaps then the teaching just needs to broaden out within those sort of disciplines to actually to highlight then those different types of, sort of functions.
Yes, because I think
Um,
it does just get overlooked, doesn't it? I mean, I think that it's covered by lots of different areas, lots of disciplines, but it's a small part quite often in terms of what overall is being taught, and therefore it gets a bit lost, I think, in that messaging of where it sits and its overall importance.
yeah, yeah, great, thank you. Um, I think we've probably there could be a lot more to discuss around the skills. I think just green skills in general, in fact, about some of those
Yeah.
gaps there. But I wanted to kind of uh, we've got about 20 minutes left, or just under 20 minutes left. So we've got just want to have time for questions at the end, but just to sort of loop back to maybe the next slide, just to think about, you know, that sort of policy piece that we were talking about earlier, about how can we kind of start to influence sort of key policy changes? So how can we get soils embedded into those different frameworks? Have you got any suggestions, of what we can do, or what mechanisms there are, or things that you're aware of at the moment of which there are opportunities?
Well, hopefully everybody did take a look at the recent consultations that have come out. The one obviously on NPPF, because there obviously was an opportunity to weave a little bit into there, more difficult because it was quite structured with very specific questions. The
Yeah,
grey belt one, however, had a little bit more scope, I think, for responding in a holistic way. And I think, certainly that is one way to start getting influence going, is by bothering. If we don't bother, how can we expect to change anything? So I think that is key. I will just put in the I can see we can add things, and I'll just put a link in because Syria Soil Community of Practice and SiLC, which is Specialists in Land Condition, came together and held a workshop back in February to look at the whole issue around the use of excavated materials on construction
mm,
sites, which is soil in its absolutely broadest sense. And out of that, there were 3 papers produced, one of which is a green paper, which we very much like any comments and feedback on. So I'm just going to find that and pop that in the chat, because
that's
we would like
great.
to hear from anyone.
We can also put these links actually
Jane,
once this goes on YouTube after, so people can have a look at that, those two. Some homework
Jack,
for the
I think
audience.
this.
This is good. Yes, Chris.
I think one of the ways we can influence is actually not just is combining professional institutes, because you've just said, and a
Mm,
combined voice from professional institutes, because, it's this planning, this is landscape architecture, this is geotechnical engineering, it's agricultural land classification, it's all across the piece. And I think we're only ever going to listen to by government if we go as a consensus across institutes and actually get together and say, what do we want? What is it
mm.
we need? And how do we deliver it? I think it would have far more clout by bringing, 3 or 4 professional institutes together to say this is what we feel needs to be done. So working across the RTPI, yourselves, Landscape Institute, I think we'd have a more powerful voice if we could actually do it across institute.
absolutely. I totally agree with that. I mean, a lot of these organisations, I mean, again, I guess like, BS Cubed have a really engaged membership that cross into lots of different sectors actually. So the expertise that we have as a combined, as well as the voice, but the expertise within the membership as
Yeah.
well is really, really, really strong.
Mm.
And like, we keep saying that soils, appears everywhere. So it would make sense definitely to join these up and to think about those. So yeah, people, certainly joint position statements is a really good way of doing that, or
Yeah.
responses to kind of consultations and things like that. So yeah, that's a really good point. We shall take that on board, Chris, with my
Okay.
BS Cubed hat on. So yeah, I mean, we're very happy to partner with lots of other organisations for these sorts of things. It makes absolutely total sense then, really, to have that combined voice.
I think as well, what would be really good is let's go for the low hanging fruit at the moment. We've got BNG. Why does BNG not mention soils? How can you divorce, what you're putting and planting in the soil from the soil? I mean, that to me just does not make sense. So we've already got a mechanism in place. Why aren't we doing that? The National Planning Policy Framework already sets out what we're trying to achieve. Why aren't we asking for a soil resource plan at the same time as we're asking about our land contamination at that planning stage? That mechanism is already there. It's not a huge step to start
Yeah.
changing
Yeah.
that way forward. And I think if we can work with what we've got, that is less of an issue than going, for regulatory change, which, is if somebody will do that for me, that's great, but that's always a much bigger mountain to climb. Let's see what we could work with what we've got, because in many ways, what I read to you about sustainable development, all our soil agenda fit under that. So
Yeah.
why are we not making
Yeah, we
better
just
use
need
of
to
that?
make sure we can hang on those different hooks that perhaps we're not doing at the
Um,
moment. Yeah.
So I was at the East Land Quality Forum last week speaking, and we had a bit of discussion about planning conditions actually, because that's another way. So, for example, Scotland West Lothian local authority actually puts conditions on there on soils to make sure they are handled and managed throughout the process. Now, again,
Mm,
very easy to do, not difficult. Now, I know we live in a world where we have to justify, why we're putting conditions on things, but it certainly, again, is another easy way to start getting better management of soils. And that mechanism is already there. But we've got to be looking at using those opportunities that we have.
yeah. No, that's really good. That's great. I think I just want to get mindful that we want to give time for a few questions. So I think that just my last point really, and I think you've probably done yours, Claire, just now, is that it's on the next slide, which is really what are your kind of takeaways? This is where everyone has to pay attention. There's been some amazing discussions, and there's some really interesting questions to come back to. But these are the kind of what are your takeaways for the audience, your key points, and some calls to action. Putting you on the spot. You
Yeah,
can
so
just
I think
yeah,
going back to planning really is to have much better EIA recognition of soils and quantifying what we've got and how we're going to deal with it. Really shaping up to the problem. Rather than it's a little bit wishy-washy at the moment,
mm,
and putting them with equal prominence to every other environmental discipline that is considered. And I think at the moment they're a little bit soils are a bit poor relation.
yeah, I would agree with that. Yeah. Claire.
Yes, I think we need to get out of our silos, join the dots, work together, because I think that's the only way we're going to solve the problem. And I suppose the other thing is, it's just left me.
We can come back
It's
to it if
gone.
it pops up.
Yeah, it's gone. But it is that whole piece about right development in the right place. That's the other bit.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And not just
which
thinking
comes back
about,
to planning.
planning again. Yeah, yeah,
All that
that's
was
great.
planning.
It all comes back to planning.
Yes, all roads lead to planning.
Ah! So I'm going to try and work through. There's been some questions popping up through the seminar, so I'll just try and work through a few of those in the last 10 minutes or so. So we've got from David. Yeah, we've been having this similar conversation for more than 15 years, but do we think anything has changed, which now means we're more likely to increase government focus on brownfield soils? So I don't
There's
know whether
a lot
that's
of
like a
rhetoric on brownfield soils, isn't there? Whether we've joined the dots over what that means. So at the moment, can we actually deliver BN? So we're saying we want to develop our brownfield sites, but can we actually deliver the biodiversity net gain on these on some of these sites? I don't think we've necessarily thought all that through, because if you've already got a unique habitat, how can you increase BNG by 10%? And in some local authorities, they're actually mandating 20%, not just the statutory 10%. I think we've got a bit of a mix up there over what that might actually mean, and I think we need to get a grip of seeing how this is actually going to work, and soils has to be part of that discussion. But it might be we could look at things like brown roofs for keeping some of those soils. That might be a possibility. So there might be other ways of looking at that. But how quickly this is going to move, unless we tackle it by tacking onto things like BNG, it's not inspiring, is it? I mean, we've been having this conversations in the construction industry. 2009 out came the code of practice. What was in there is all the things we're still talking about. We said we'd manage soils sustainably by 2030. I don't know whether anyone has noticed, but we've only got 5 years and a quarter to go.
Time has run out and is running out. Yes, exactly. I don't know, Christy, do you want to come in on that?
I mean, I just come in on the
Thanks, Claire.
BNG, because I think as a practitioner, I'm having quite a lot of problems with BNG. A lot of other practitioners are, particularly with the metric. It's throwing out some very interesting results, one could say. So, I mean, yes, any thought of bringing soils into BNG would need to be carefully considered. And I also feel you need to be pragmatic. I mean, I find the problem with the metric at the moment, you're putting trying to measure something that is very difficult to measure. And, so I think it needs very careful thought is how you would do that, but not averse to it. But I think, it's actually how it's implemented, because I think you see the metric at the moment will potentially cause lots of delays in planning. It won't speed it up. It's going to slow it down. So, caution.
A good idea, but done right. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. There's another question on, let me just flick through some of these, which is a more overarching one around, there's a link that I'm now having to click through. Which is around, the new DEFRA review, which is on, I'm trying to open the question. Just to understand the panel's view on the DEFRA regulation review that's just come out, that's being led by Dan Corrie, who's just been appointed to lead this review. I don't know if you've seen it. I think it's just come out in the last couple of days, but to transform regional economies across the country through the development of a circular economy by reusing more existing materials to drive down waste across key sectors such as construction, packaging, reducing import costs for businesses and cutting carbon emissions.
So in terms of circular economy and excavated soils, Environment Agency have been involved, I think possibly with the organisation Claire, looking at pilot studies of what are called hospitals and hotels.
Oh, yes, of course.
Hotels,
Yeah.
obviously, you can enjoy just staying in them. Whereas obviously if you're a hospital, you need a bit of remediation because you need to get well again. And so the whole premise is that we stop throwing soils away, but we have somewhere to put them, because obviously on a lot of urban sites, particularly where we're building basements, there is no space for storage of soils on site. Their only option is to get rid of them. And obviously we want to prevent the 63% of waste currently in the mineral soils and soil sector that our national statistics tell us we have at the moment.
Yes, a lot of it going to landfill. The proportion is enormous, isn't it?
It is 63%
Yeah,
of the UK waste.
yeah, yeah, yeah. But that's quite an interesting concept. I think some other countries have been trialing this. I think it's in Belgium. This idea around having these hospitals and places where then those soils from those sites could be
Yeah,
placed
so
for a certain amount of time. So ones that need, some remediation will receive that, and others that again is then looking after them whilst they're kind of in having a holiday away from home to be
yes,
redistributed somewhere else. But yeah, it can work. But I guess that's the answer, that there are already countries then developing these things. So this is something that can actually be done in practice. The infrastructure is another issue around that, but it's quite
yes, and I
positive
think
to
that's
see that that's
I
happening.
think that's the somewhere like the Netherlands, it's not, it doesn't have as many rural tracts of land as we do, where trying to set up these things will probably be quite a lot more challenging. But yes, so they've been using it in Denmark, I think, as well. Netherlands have had
Yeah.
soil hospitals for a long time, and there's nothing like learning from other people, is there?
No,
Um,
exactly.
Yeah, I
Exactly.
mean,
Don't reinvent the
I
wheel when, yeah. Yeah.
mean, potentially this is something that, the Mineral Products Association could get involved in, because obviously quarries have
Mm,
scale and size,
yes.
and they are
Yeah.
often going to site anyway with aggregates. So if you could backload soils and they provided a location where they could be looked after, and then as a sort of trading post, potentially they are very good locations
Mm,
to place them, and they have all the kit, have the screens, they have all the processing material to look after them. So maybe it's something that could tie in with the mineral sector. They would be ideal partners to deal with.
yeah, absolutely. That makes absolute perfect sense to use sort of, yes,
Mm,
those existing sort of frameworks
yeah.
that exist. Yeah, that's a really good idea. We've just got time for one more question. So we're going to, finish on because I always like to finish on a positive note. But it's a kind of like more of an example. I mean, don't have to name one in particular. You can do, but thinking about a really good example of best practice from brownfield in England, or the sorts of things that you should be, that have been done. So you maybe don't want to name one in particular development site, or you can do, but just to kind of give an idea about, what's possible. Deep thinking. We've talked
Oh
about our
goodness.
wish list of things. Is anyone
I
actually
think I
doing
think it
it? Is
is
there
more. I think it is more of a wish list,
this?
probably. I mean,
Okay. Yeah.
certainly, we as a land contamination sector are very much beginning to think much more about the impact that we are having on soils when we are remediating them, and whether there are techniques and ways that are better than others in terms of being much more sustainable. And I think we're going to see a lot more sort of research looking at things like fungi and uh,
Mm,
bioremediation techniques and phytoremediation techniques, where you are getting added value of cleanup and carbon sequestration, etc. And the techniques that might, for example, like using heating the ground that destroys the the fabric of the soil, may be something that wouldn't be something that would be pursued because it would no longer be sustainable. So I think that's what we're beginning to see. People are using carbon tools to try and work out what is the best solution. So that's the big thing we're seeing, is that the application of tools to help us make those decisions.
Yeah, that's good to see. That's good to see.
I
Chris, have you got
think for
any
me,
quick?
yeah, it's just planning for soils, and I think we've touched on it, from the start of the process to actually when it's on site, and actually handling soils quickly and effectively. Ideally, you strip them, you place them, and then, that is the ideal scenario. So I think it's actually thinking very carefully about your construction and, phasing it in such a way that, we don't have soils in storage for a long time, and they quickly get re-established, and with a bit of TLC they recover quickly.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. That is exactly what we want. More TLC for soils.
Yeah.
I'm afraid we've run out of time now, but thanks everybody for your questions. On behalf of the British Society of Soil Science, I'd really like to express my thanks to Chris Howes and Claire Dickinson. I've really enjoyed our discussion today, and for your insights. It's been absolutely brilliant. And thank you to the audience, for everybody for attending. When you leave the seminar, there'll be a little quick feedback survey, so please do fill that in. As I mentioned at the beginning, the recording of the webinar will be available on our YouTube channel after the event, so you can watch back. Our next webinar is on Tuesday, the 5th of November, and that's from 4 till 5 p.m. This is one that has been rescheduled from earlier in the year, and this is on international governance on soils. So really exciting. So talking a bit about policy again. So do keep an eye on our website. So do sign up for that webinar. It's only in a couple of weeks' time. And anyway, I'd like to hope to see you at some of our future events at BS Cubed as well. We have our annual meeting that's coming up at the end of the year in December. So yep, there it is, the slide. There's the details. It's in Cardiff this year. Registration is open, so we hope to see you there. And the theme of that is sustainable soils for people and planet. So in the meantime, thanks very much for joining, and hope to see you at our future events.